Good. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, all good.
All right. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Oh, I'm just got a little bit of background audio here. I'm really, yeah, we're good. We're good. I'm really happy to be here on behalf of 16-bit and myself, of course. I've been watching the McMaster Healthcare AI rounds for quite some time, and I think the program is doing a great job. So I'm happy to be a part of it and share what I can from my experience. So today we're going to be talking about the story of Rho and how we at 16-bit have gone from idea to regulatory approved opportunistic software medical device. So happy to get into it. About me, so I'm a practicing diagnostic radiologist at True North Imaging. I've got a background in engineering science, and I completed my radiology residency at the University of Toronto. And really my dream growing up was to build tools that I could use as a physician to improve the practice of medicine. And so I'm trying to live that out through combining my passions in healthcare and radiology and in engineering and computer science. And so really 16-bit is the vehicle that has helped me do that. Obviously, some disclosures, I'm a shareholder of 16-bit, and 16-bit has received funding from Amgen through the investigator-initiated grant funding. The objectives of today's talk, I want to educate you all about osteoporosis and the opportunity that opportunistic screening presents to improve population health. I want to enhance your understanding of how AI can be practically implemented clinically to improve patient care. And then I want to inspire some of you maybe to explore entrepreneurship in healthcare and how you can go about doing that. We'll start off with the founding of 16-bit. I'll give you a bit of background there. And then we'll touch on our endeavors in pediatric bone age and then how that inspired the next product we developed in opportunistic screening. We'll talk about that, how we do that with Rho, and then what's next for us. So 16-bit, founded in late 2016. My partner and I, Alexander Bilbilly, we were residents in the residency program at U of T. As part of the Royal College requirements for residency, we were required to do a research project. We were research inclined, but we were looking around at various opportunities, and we really found that the next wave of AI was well underway. We're 2016 here, so the AlexNet paper had been published. AI was starting to percolate into various domains, but was not really prevalent in medical imaging or medicine specifically. And so around that time, we were able to acquire about 60,000 chest x-rays, and we were performing the research at St. Michael's Hospital. We published this paper here that was published in Investigative Radiology. And really, we just took off-the-shelf technology. GoogleNet at the time, we tried various different types of convolutional neural network architectures. And we were amazed that the technology was so successful with such relatively little training data and very little hand engineering. And this was sort of a wake-up call to us being trainees in the program and seeing, what does the future of radiology hold, and how could we make a difference in changing that path. And so really that was the inspiring moment for us. And we took that experience, we applied to the H2I, which is a Health to Innovation campus-linked accelerator at U of T. We applied to a pitch competition, and we were awarded a $5,000 seed investment or seed grant, you could call it. Little did we know that the mentorship that we would receive over the years was worth far more than the $5,000. But suffice it to say, this really sort of kickstarted us on our way to 16-bit, and really our why at 16-bit is to create breakthrough software medical device products that improve healthcare. And we know that in order to do that, we must challenge the status quo as physicians, innovators, and patients alike. And so I'd like to talk about a little bit how we do that. Our how is really, we think that we've got a rare combination. And so we use our clinical hats and our clinical expertise to pick out the real problems that exist in the world. And then with our technical hats, we leverage emerging technologies. And probably most importantly, we try to round that out with generating stakeholder value. Now, healthcare is different from really any other industry. The person who buys the software or the product is different than the person who uses it, is different than the ultimate person or the patient who benefits from it the most or should benefit. And so with that complex interaction of stakeholders, innovating in healthcare is not easy. And so you really have to keep that in mind from the very beginning. And so fast forward 1 year to 2017, the RSNA, the Radiology Society of North America, launched their inaugural machine learning challenge. And this first one was to predict pediatric bone age from a hand x-ray. This is a very niche test that's done in pediatric patients who are maybe growing too fast or too slow. And we look at this test to compare the bone maturity to the patient's chronological age. So the way this is done today or before our recent advancements was that we would look up in an atlas book that was published in 1960. We would look at the x-ray and try to match up what is the most similar x-ray that this patient has compared to the atlas. And then we assign it sort of a categorical age. And then we say, well, is it plus minus 2 standard deviations from the mean for that age? And then we say, delayed or appropriate or advanced. And so you can see, yep.
I apologize for the interruption. There are some messages that your voice is a little low. Is it possible for you to get closer to your computer or a little speak a little louder? I appreciate that.
Sure. Yeah, I can speak a little louder. I have another microphone if that doesn't work, but why don't you let me know maybe in a couple minutes. Yeah. So really the point of pediatric bone age is that we're creating it's really a quantitative task. It wants to be quantitative. We're trying to assign a numerical value to this X-ray, but because of limitations of the human eye, we can't produce that number. So we make it a qualitative task. So ultimately, this seems ripe for innovation with AI, and some other researchers at Stanford had published a paper around this time where they had curated that data set and actually donated it for the purpose of this competition. And so we were lucky to leverage that data set that was then open sourced to the community for the competition. So what you see here is actually our full-fledged product. Now, it didn't start out this way, of course. Immediately after the competition, we had won first place, and we had put out a demo on our website for people to just try out and to get a flavor of the technology. And what we found was over the course of a year, we were getting hundreds of uploads per day. If the site was down because it had filled up disk space, we would know instantaneously through our email. And so we realized that the market really wanted something like this. And we had no intent to commercialize it initially because we knew that bone age was relatively small and it's a really niche market. It's a really niche test. And so we didn't think that there would be a market. But really, in this case, the market kind of pulled it out of our hands. And so we said, well, maybe there's a learning opportunity here. So what we did is we said, we're going to use Physis as a learning opportunity, as a dress rehearsal, to go through the regulatory process, to get the approval, Health Canada approval, so that we can be in a good place for our future products. And that's what we did. So we launched Physis in August of 2022. We received Health Canada approval just before that. We also licensed the Grulich and Powell Atlas from Stanford University Press. And this allowed us to build a better product because we're now an aid to the radiologist, and they certainly appreciate it. So 4 independent publications later, and Physis is being used clinically, and I think saving a lot of time. So I touch on that story more as an inspiration to what would come next, because really the learning from that was that we could take an image, and a collection of thousands or millions of pixels, and we can distill that image, we can compress it down to a single numerical value. That is the age in months. And so that got us thinking. Obviously, we now are going through our fellowship, and now some of us become staff radiologists. We're looking at x-rays, we're looking at studies, and we're gaining experience. And now we're open to new problems. And we have now a lens through which we can solve them. So osteoporosis, we knew was a big societal problem. And we, having a baseline in the disease, we knew that there could be some opportunities to solve it with AI. And so osteoporosis, for those of you who don't know, is really a gradual weakening of the bone architecture and density, which results in the weakening of the bone. And ultimately, as people age, that naturally occurs. But when it occurs really fast, patients are at risk of what we call fragility fractures, or fractures that occur from very little impact. And it's very common. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men will suffer an osteoporotic fracture in their lifetime. It's more common than heart attack, stroke, breast cancer combined. Each year in the United States and Canada, there are over 2 million fractures. It accounts for $53 billion in the healthcare budget. And importantly, it's a silent disease. So you don't know that you have it until you suffer a fracture, and then you may need surgery, or even worse, it carries a high mortality rate as well if you suffer a hip fracture. Now, if it's caught early, it is manageable and treatable. There are lifestyle modifications, calcium, vitamin D, over-the-counter medications, or even some pharmaceuticals that can be taken to actually reverse or slow the disease process. And so, this is why in most nations, we like to screen for osteoporosis, because the societal cost is high. There's an intervention that can take place to save both patient morbidity and mortality, as well as economic cost. Now, normally in most industrialized countries, the gold standard is something called a DEXA. It's a dual energy X-ray absorptiometry test. It's a low dose energy. It takes X-rays at 2 different energies. That's the dual part, and it tries to basically subtract or compensate for the soft tissue component of the attenuation, and therein it tries to predict the bone content in the subject. Now, the problem with DEXA is that it's another test, and that patients, there's guidelines that exist, but because osteoporosis is a silent disease, patients really don't, it's not top of mind. It's not top of mind to primary care providers as well, because really it's preventative care. Acute care often takes precedent. And so for all these combination of factors, we have a really low screening rate. About 25% of patients who should be getting screened are actually getting screened. So large percentage of the population not being screened, and this results in actual underutilized DEXA capacity with machines sitting idle. So whenever building a breakthrough, you really have to have a secret. What is your secret that you think is true that others may not agree with you? And ultimately, you want to be right about that secret. And so our secret was that we believe that X-rays contained a vast amount of information about a patient's bone health. They're widely performed, but the information that we're able to extract from them as humans was being underutilized. And so what we went on to discover was that, in fact, around 80% of patients who don't have DEXA have had an X-ray, are over the age of 50, and they've had an X-ray for some other purpose, whether it be a cough to rule out pneumonia, or they have knee pain, so they go for a knee X-ray. These X-rays exist for typically acute conditions, but we can extract information from them to get more information about a patient's bone health. And so fast forward now to around 2019, we came up with the idea, and we worked on it for about 2.5 years. And as of July 2022, we received Health Canada approval for our product called Rho. And so what you see here is a PACS environment where a radiologist would view an X-ray. And on the right-hand side, there's an extra image. It's a Rho report. And that report has a score, and that score has a meaning related to the patient's bone health. So our intended use for Rho as a device is to analyze frontal radiographs performed for any clinical indication in patients aged 50 and older to generate a risk score, which correlates with the likelihood of having low BMD on DEXA. And through our experimentation, we are able to use any of these 6 body part X-rays, which are the lumbar spine, the thoracic spine, the chest, the pelvis, the knee, the hand, or the wrist, and we can compute that score. So altogether, that's about 80% of all X-rays performed. It's a large majority. And so we were designated a breakthrough device by the FDA because there's huge potential for screening. And we're currently pending FDA de novo approval as well as approval in Australia. And just to sort of describe a little bit about our training process and our experimentation process, when we came up with the idea, at first we were thinking that, hey, maybe we can take a lumbar spine X-ray and we can predict a lumbar spine bone density. That seemed obvious to us that we could do that. And then when we received some data to test this hypothesis, we found it to be true. We then extended the hypothesis to say, well, what if we could also predict the femoral neck bone mineral density score, which is oftentimes not in the image of a lumbar spine. Sure enough, we ran that experiment predicting 2 different numbers, both the lumbar spine and the femoral neck from a lumbar spine X-ray, and there was a strong correlation. So we said, well, what if we take a thoracic spine X-ray and try to predict both outputs as well? And sure enough, there was a correlation. And we said, well, you know, a thoracic spine looks a lot like a chest X-ray, and why don't we get more data across different body parts and see what happens? And sure enough, the correlation exists. And it was that sort of insight that led us to receive our patent for some of the claims related to predicting body part targets that were not in the image. So just a bit about the Rho report. So the Rho score, as I mentioned, we're actually predicting the bone mineral density, but for regulatory purposes and to avoid confusion amongst users, we don't present it as a T-score. We present it as a Rho score, which correlates to the likelihood of having low bone density. We know that DEXA is a very precise test. It uses X-rays at 2 different energies. It can safely compensate for the soft tissue. Now, our neural network is basically doing this, you know, sort of in the background, but to a degree that is A, probably not very explainable by humans, but B, it's hard to quantify. So all in all, there is error, and what we're trying to do, we're trying to predict, let's say, from a hand X-ray, what someone's femoral neck score might be. So although the correlation exists, the further, more peripheral X-rays that you have, if you have degenerative changes, these all of these things, as well as even patient factors. Maybe a patient has a different distribution due to their level of exercise. So suffice it to say, there's a correlation, there's a relationship, but that relationship is going to vary by both the X-ray type and the patient. So we're not equivalent to a DEXA, but what we're trying to do, and this is part of the clinical insight, is we're trying to funnel patients who should appropriately be referred for DEXA onto that next step, so that we can get them diagnosed, and we can do so with a very widely used modality in a large percentage of the population. And so, how does it work in clinical practice? So here's sort of a workflow that is typical of an imaging clinic or hospital. Anytime any of the patients have any of these 6 X-ray body parts imaged, the technologist will take the examination. They'll send their images over to their PACS system. Rho is typically sitting on premise, installed on a physical or a virtual machine, and it's always listening for these new X-rays. And when it finds one, it first conducts some quality control tests. So it has actually a built-in classifier. We devised a built-in classifier, machine learning classifier, to categorize the body part in the image as well as the view, because we're actually only using the frontal projections of the image, and X-ray images typically have a few views in the series that it's being performed. And so we're able to build that classifier both to act as a filter for input to the model, but also for quality control, because we're also looking for images that are maybe overexposed or not adequate in terms of their field of view. So once Rho decides that an X-ray is adequate, it will perform the BMD inference, and then only if it exceeds a certain threshold. So you saw the Rho score scale there. The default threshold we use is 6. So 6 and above, that's about an 85% likelihood of having low BMD. And so if it exceeds that threshold, then that report is sent over to the PACS, and then the radiologist will view that by the time they open the image. That whole process takes 1 to 2 minutes and can be shortened if needed, but typically that's sufficient. So the radiologist then opens the case. They now have their Rho report on screen. They look at the X-ray, they make their findings, and then they can, if they like, they can include a macro. We have a sample here that basically says, hey, based on Rho, this screening device, this patient has been identified to have to be at risk for low BMD. So suggest a clinical fracture risk assessment, and if indicated, this patient should be referred for DEXA. We have an FAQ for patients or physicians if they have questions or concerns about what this device does. And then that report goes back to the primary care provider or whomever ordered the test, and then they can perform that clinical fracture risk assessment if not already performed. And then if needed, they could send the patient for DEXA. And so that's the workflow we're envisioning here, and that's how it's currently being done. So clinical validation, we recently published a paper in a JACR, which looked at 3 different data sets. The primary metric we used for approval is the area under the curve. And the area under the curve basically measures how good is this algorithm at discriminating the normal from abnormal cases. So a score of 1 is considered perfect, and a score of 0.5 is considered random chance. And you can see anywhere between 0.8 to 0.9 is considered very good. So across different data sets, Rho is able to generalize, but also some of these data sets were different countries or occurred over a different time period, which is always good to see generalizability. And then the final data set here is actually a US-based data set that we used for FDA approval. And in that, we were looking at the different interactions across different racial groups and how Rho performed there, which is also important for generalizability. This table shows the Rho score as it pertains to different sexes as well as different body parts. So as I mentioned, a hand might have a little bit less signal than a pelvis or lumbar spine, but generally you can see the sensitivity and specificity is reasonable, considering these are opportunistically acquired. This is basically free information that we're able to extract. And then this is the optimal Rho score. So we actually allow sites to increase their threshold. If they want to be more specific, they can pick a threshold of 7 and have their specificity bump up to the +90 range at the expense of the number of patients they're going to catch or their sensitivity. Some real world results. So we've been using Rho at my clinic, True North Imaging, for a year and a half now. And one of the key metrics we wanted to track was how many patients were coming back for DEXA and how many of them actually had low bone mineral density. And so after a year of tracking these, we found that about 25% of patients who were flagged Rho positive would actually come back to our center for DEXA. And it's not to say that some of those patients might have gone elsewhere, but at least what we're seeing is a 25% conversion. And then when we looked at those DEXA scores, we were able to see that 90% at a Rho score threshold of 6 had a positive predictive value for low bone mineral density. So very, very reasonable performance on that regard, and that's at the default threshold. Further, we looked at the fracture risk of these patients and found that 50% had an increased fracture risk, meaning a greater than 10% fracture risk by DEXA when considering their age, sex, and other clinical risk factors such as prior fracture and steroid use. We also did a study at Sunnybrook through the Can Health Initiative, where we screened over 1,100 patients and we identified 572 at risk. About 29% of those went on for BMD referral, and we found very similar positive predictive value for low BMD, a little bit higher increased fracture risk, and we found that radiologists like to use the software. There was no real complaints about using it in their workflow. And then additionally, we noticed that 27% of patients actually went on to have further conversations with their referring providers, which is another useful insight in terms of the value that Rho is providing. So all in all, we think that opportunistic screening, especially with Rho, provides many benefits for a variety of stakeholders. For institutions, we allow for improving their population's health, increasing their reimbursable services, improving operational efficiency, and we can do this with no upfront cost or equipment or radiation exposure to the patient. For radiologists, this Rho can facilitate the detection of low BMD. You know, it's actually very technically challenging to detect osteopenia on X-ray, which is why not a lot of radiologists do it from day to day unless they're aided with Rho. And so this allows a radiologist to increase DEXA referrals appropriately in patients who would most benefit from it. And then finally, we've worked hard to really seamlessly integrate Rho into the workflow. For patients, this means an earlier diagnosis, more time to implement therapy, and hopefully, we hope, reduce their risk of fracture. So we've been screening across many different sites, a growing list of customers. We've screened over 120,000 Canadians in the last year and a half. We've got several strategic partnerships, and we're also part of changing the paradigm of screening is actually going to the media and getting the story out and making our customers sort of show that they are the heroes really in adopting this new technology for AI. So that's been part of our journey. I want to highlight that, you know, we always talk a lot about the AI model, what's its performance and whatnot, but after going through this process, we sort of attribute less than 10% of the work to be related to the AI model. So much work goes into the integration of the software. What is surrounding that AI model? How is it functioning? How are you monitoring it? All of these things are so important. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then this is just some slides of the actual dashboard that we allow. So you can really see a population health level perspective of patients' bone health through using Rho. And we've worked hard to allow for that integration and customization for different sites. And then finally, I just want to touch on the regulatory requirements which come hand in hand with any medical device. So, you know, any software that is analyzing a physiologic process is going to be considered a medical device, typically a class 2 by Health Canada and most bodies. That necessitates having a quality management system. That quality management system needs to be audited. It's a very lengthy process that occurs over multiple years. And really, I like to think of it as a muscle. You have to build the muscle and the culture of quality within the organization developing that software medical device. And that comes in the form of a lot of SOPs and documentation procedures, which we have learned over the last several years to develop within our organization. So I mean, this couldn't have been possible without this wonderful team that we have composed at 16-bit. Of course, my partner, Alexander Bilbilly, and I are tremendously grateful for one another. I would highly recommend having a co-founder if you do decide to go on this journey of entrepreneurship within healthcare or any other industry for that matter. Starting a startup is very hard. You need someone to lean on and someone to complement you. And so us together, we've really allowed each other to still have clinical careers, which allows us to see those opportunities, but also have the ability to execute on them and manage a team. And our other members of the team, Katrina has helped us tremendously with our quality management system, our research publications, and our regulatory submissions. We wouldn't be where we are today without her. Kuhan is our head of strategy and market access, so really tying in that part of generating stakeholder value for everybody needs to start from day one, and he's been with us since then. And then, of course, our technical team to engineer the product, like I said, to build that product around the AI model is so important. So we've iterated consistently over the last year and a half to redevelop the product, allow for over-the-air updates, especially within a healthcare setting. That's very difficult to do. And so these are some of the things that you need to consider, and we're thankful for the wonderful team. So finally, what's next for 16-bit? Of course, we're looking at international expansion upon new regulatory approval. We're looking at reimbursement strategies. So we believe that there is value in Rho from a societal perspective to reduce fractures long-term at the expense of earlier and more appropriate screening up front, and then, of course, treatment. So we're looking to develop these economic models that help prove that. We're always looking for new channel partners to integrate with, as well as in scaling our sales and customer support. And then, of course, a lot of our customers say, hey, you can generate new DEXs for me. Can you help me actually report them? So this is part of the improving healthcare efficiency aspect, which we're looking at with great interest. So with that, I want to thank you all for your attention. I want to thank these organizations for helping us get to where we are today. And I'm, of course, happy to answer your questions from any angle. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. This was a very interesting talk. I know I do a little bit of X-ray AI work myself, so personally interested. But I'll wait to hear from the audience first before I ask questions. Anybody in the audience, if you have questions, just go on mute and start talking. Or if somebody else is asking a question, you want to get in the queue, just click the hand, raise your hand electronically. Go ahead. Mackenzie, I assume you want to ask a question. That's why
Yeah, hi. I'm Mackenzie Bacon. I'm from St. Joseph's Healthcare Hamilton. This was an excellent presentation. I was just wondering if you've done any work in relation to using this in long-term care, and has there been any relationship to fall risk in this patient population?
It's a great question. So first of all, the patient population of long-term care, they tend to follow a different fracture risk model. They don't typically follow the FRAX model. Part of it is they're assumed to all be at risk, basically all be osteopenic or have low bone density. So it's more of an approach of looking at what is their actual falls risk? Are they on multiple medications? I think there's a whole other fracture risk model that's applied to long-term care facilities, which is different from community dwelling patients. So this particular application is looking more at those community dwelling patients, but it's certainly interesting. I think there's certainly new research questions that can be explored there to see maybe there's some opportunity to enhance how those patients are screened and how they're managed, and it's certainly something we would look at. I think your second, do you have a second question regarding fracture risk? We are actively looking at how we can use this technology to actually predict fracture risk directly. So the whole reason we do a DEXA is not to get a bone mineral density per se. We don't necessarily care about bone mineral density. Rather, that bone mineral density score is used as input to a fracture risk model. We're treating patients' risk of fracture, not their bone mineral density directly. And so what we hypothesize is that Rho has enough signal about the patient's bone mineral density that we can use the Rho T-score, the quote unquote Rho T-score that is predicted, and we can use that as input to FRAX models, and we can hopefully achieve something that is of similar accuracy to FRAX or other fracture risk models that are currently using the DEXA today. So that's an area of active research, and we're excited to share our publications in the coming months on that.
Go ahead.
Mark, thank you. Yeah, Mark, thank you so much. A great talk and a great story to see how this moves forward. I'm actually trying to look at how we look at things like AI and the changes coming along with respect to things like our professional identity as physicians, as well as the ethics of using this and how it changes our profession in general. In fact, we're putting together a conference on that at the ICRE in the fall. I'd love to hear what you think in terms of how this changes how a radiologist practices, and whether some of these things will then allow radiologists to automate some things. So maybe right now they're using it, side by side with their radiology stuff they're looking at, but maybe this will just become an automated thing that just gets plugged into the thing, because you don't need to supervise it, perhaps, if it gets that good. And then, like, how do you see that changing radiology, pathology, maybe other clinical domains, and how we should be preparing our residents, our staff, for these kinds of things, please?
Yeah, good question. I think as it pertains to Rho, it's really opened my eyes to the number of patients we were missing before the advent of the AI. It's remarkable how many cases that if you presented it to a radiologist, they would either not comment on it, or they would say it's probably normal. And it turns out that they are, in fact, osteopenic or sometimes even osteoporotic. It's really sort of opened our eyes to that sort of blind spot, I think, as radiologists. I think there's probably a case to be made that this technology can run sort of autonomously without the sort of check by the radiologist. I mean, it's a very low risk device when you think of the risk. We're actually recommending a clinical fracture risk assessment on patients when this clinical fracture risk assessment is indicated in patients who are 50 and up anyways, because there's guidelines that say if they're at increased risk at that age, then they should go for a DEXA. Well, you don't know that until you actually do the risk calculation. So we're not actually recommending anything other in this population that's not already recommended, but we're sort of intelligently nudging the physician to say, hey, this patient right here, you should definitely do it, because we actually see signs before that. And maybe there's a world where down the line we have evidence to say, you know what, you can probably skip the fracture risk assessment. You can go straight to DEXA because you now have a strong pretest probability. The flip side is also, can you use Rho to actually say, hey, you know what, these patients, we've the guidelines say to do a DEXA because they're over 65, but they had an X-ray and their bones look great. And by Rho, we can actually have a high negative predictive value to exclude those patients from the existing screening. That will take some time to research, and there will probably be caveats on how that gets rolled out, but we think that's potentially possible. From the whole training aspect, I think I see a lot of AI as just being sort of the new standard for a lot of things. Like, they give the example of calculators and doing math, and now we have language models, and we're all going to forget how to write sentences because we're using ChatGPT too frequently. I can't say whether or not that's a good thing for society or not, but I can say that we are pretty resilient in devising new ways to add value and iterating on what we do as both as a species and as a profession. So all in all, it's going to be interesting, and I'm happy to continue the dialogue on that topic.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have Mohammed raise his hand. I also, when there is a chance, I wanted to, if you we get the chance to talk about this. I was hoping if you can tell us in your validation study of where you give us AUCs, what was the ground truth? Was there like a bone densimeter also used on the same patients? I assume there was some validation going, right?
Yeah, so in order to create the data set, we had to collect patients who had a DEXA and an X-ray within 1 year of each other, right? So we get that data set, we extracted the DEXA T-scores, and then we paired it to the X-ray.
Good.
Now, most patients had that, we call it the delta T between the X-ray and the DEXA, the date difference. Most patients had a plus minus of 1 month, but they could be anywhere up to 1 year. And so we do that to increase our data set, of course. And then when we tested it, we also look at the impact that delta T has on that on the result. And we use the BMD as the gold standard. So that was the gold standard. I mean, from the lumbar spine, there can be degenerative changes which could impact, but that is the clinical gold standard. So we thought that was sufficient. And I mean, you could do really, there's no other more applicable or practical gold standard I think you could use. And
that brings up this question. You didn't really get into the details of your models, but I was wondering, given what you just said, is your model essentially is it a regression model trying to, given the chest X-ray, produce what you get from the bone density?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
So we have two outputs. We try to predict the femoral neck and the lumbar spine. So it's a multi-regression from that X-ray image. We also include the age and sex of the patient as well, because there are some predisposing factors that obviously would help the model to predict what that patient would be. Now, it resulted in a slight improvement, but generally, most of the signal is in the image.
Okay. Thank you. Mohammed, did you have a question? You had raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. My question is, how did you account for confounding factors? For example, if someone has a bone disease like multiple myeloma, for example. And the second question, have you looked at other imaging modalities such as CT as opposed to X-rays?
That's a good question. So we did not correct for any presence of bone disease or implants either. So let's say a patient has bilateral hip arthroplasties, meaning they don't have, they have artificial hip joints, and we have a pelvis, and we're trying to predict the femoral neck BMD. Well, for that patient, we didn't train that they had that value because they don't have the ground truth. But it's not to say that because when they would have the DEXA, they wouldn't have that value. They would have had just their lumbar spine and probably their forearm scan. So we wouldn't have the ground truth there. But the fact that we can then take that and use that image for inference allows us to get to a value of what this patient's femoral neck score would be had they not had their hip replacement. Now, the validity of that has not been studied, but in my experience, when arthroplasties are present, there's not a huge confounding impact, meaning the model is not doing what you think it's doing. So it's not necessarily looking at a pelvis X-ray and finding the femur and saying, what is the density at this femoral neck? It's probably concentrating in that area, but as a mechanism to correct for soft tissue, the model is also looking at, well, what's the patient's body habitus? What's the bone distribution and mineralization elsewhere in the image? And sort of with all that sort of gestalt approach, come to a value. That's why we can take an X-ray in a patient that's had an arthroplasty and actually predict a value. And it would be interesting to see patients pre and post arthroplasty. If we were to have a DEXA pre, then we could actually figure out how good is the model at predicting it post, because the bone density would be unlikely to change much, but we're kind of simulating the presence of that. So it's actually an interesting potential research question. Your second question?
Did you use modalities? CT?
Oh yes, CT. CT is a good modality. There's a subset of patients that won't get an X-ray. They'd be more likely to get a CT. On CT, we have three-dimensional volumes. So really, in my mind, it's not a machine learning problem anymore. We're actually you can just calculate the density by taking the volume and taking the attenuation and figuring out the density. From an opportunistic perspective, there are other companies and organizations who've done that type of work, but we knew that X-ray is done orders of magnitude, 10x more than CT. So as a population health screening modality, X-ray is much better. But CT, I think you can get almost pretty much equivalent to DEXA, if not better, because you've got the full volume. So it's a good modality. I think it could probably essentially replace the need for the DEXA if it's not already doing that in some jurisdictions.
Great. Any more questions from the audience? I see a hand here. Madi.
Hi, Maddie. Yeah, nice. Thanks for the nice talk. I just have a quick question. It's same thing about the confounding, because I know when you read the X-ray, like the exposure and how patient distant and position in front of the machine. So how you count for these things?
It's interesting because when we first hypothesized the project, I using sort of the physics background, I thought that if we included the source to detector distance and we included the KVP, the voltage and the exposure as inputs to the model, that would improve the model's performance. We tried that and it didn't work. It didn't improve anything. And typically, when developing a machine learning model, you want to think about what's going to be available to you at the time of inference. And if there was a significant increase, then you have to kind of trade off both things. But less is always better if you can. If there's no improvement in performance, less is always better. Or if there's modest improvement, sometimes less is better. So if we did include those values and then we rolled it out into production, and those values were not properly entered, in health data there's often missing data. So if that was the case, then we would have a problem, right? So age, sex, and the image, those are always going to be there, right? And so I thought that was an interesting insight, that we thought including those values would help, but in actuality, it didn't help. And one of the reasons could be that the model is able to figure that out, right? Like we've seen these models have been able to predict race purportedly, that they can predict, whether or not, a patient is of certain ethnic origin just based on the image, even when that image is distorted by a vast amount of noise. Whether there's a shortcut that the models are using to figure this out, or some confounding variables is an interesting question. But if true, then it would seem likely that the models are able to compensate. And this was my hypothesis, that based on areas of the image where the patient was not occupying. Like there's always part of the image, there's air, there's soft tissue, and then there's bone. So is the model able to use that gradient, that shift to actually see how much of the soft tissue component is there? And then just by virtue of using lots of different types of images, it was able to ignore some of the exposure factors and technical acquisition parameters, such that it could result in a value that's accurate or reasonably accurate for all different types of settings.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, we should stop here. This was a great talk and a lot of interaction. I appreciate everyone asking questions and being active on this. So I want to thank everyone for joining. The next AI in Healthcare round will be on Wednesday, April 17th. We ask that if you could kindly scan this QR code that you see and complete an evaluation survey following today's session. And also remember that you can watch this and past rounds on our Mac video page on the YouTube channel at Mac Health ICE. And thank you everyone, and especially Mark for a very insightful talk. And I look forward to hopefully collaborating with you at some point on the X-ray work.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mehdi. Thanks, everyone. Pleasure.